So it's all based on a comparison of models and observations. Unfortunately, the models are uncertain and the observations are uncertain. So you have a comparison of two uncertain quantities. And to make them agree, you have to do some careful cheating. I call it that. It is, in fact, a fraudulent kind of exercise, as I will show you. After you read the summary, you have to go through 9 chapters, which are about 1,000 pages, before you find, finally, Chapter 10. And Chapter 10 is the one that tells you, that gives you the so-called evidence. But I will show you the evidence. It's essentially one graph. One graph. That's all the evidence they have. And the graph is faulty. Chapter 10 on attribution. Here is the graph. This is the graph that shows global temperature, not just global temperature of the surface, of the Earth's surface, over the last century. Basically, from about 1880 to 2010. You will see that there are 2 episodes of warming reported. There's one from about 1910 to 1940, and I think that warming is genuine. And then there's cooling, and then there's another warming episode from about 1975 onward, and that warming is problematic. I'm not sure it is genuine. You will see something else on this graph. Hidden there, and very difficult to see, are the results of the models. Now you say about 30 models. How do they do that? Well, they average them in some way. And when you average them, you find that they coincide almost perfectly, so they claim, with the observations. Isn't that wonderful? Perfect agreement. Well, it really isn't. They're cheating. First of all, the models are uncertain by about 300%. We know that because the quoted sensitivities in the IPCC report are between 1.5 degrees and 4.5 degrees for a doubling of CO2. That's a factor of 3 uncertainty. That's 300%. And that's just in the report. If you go to the research literature, you find that you can get 11 degrees warming with a doubling of CO2. So you get 1,000% change. So which one of these models are you going to take? Obviously, you'll pick the one that agrees with the observations. It's something called curve fitting. So by careful selection of the model, you can always get agreement. Even though there's agreement here, the agreement here is very poor before 1960. They don't mention that. They slide over that. For example, you don't get the agreement between the absolutely sure warming between 1910 and 1940. Let me show you how that looks. This shows it more clearly. I think Carl Friedrich Ebert will love this. This shows some of the data points before adjustment. So you see the warming here between about 1910 and 1940, cooling, and the claimed warming from about 1975 onward to the present. The red line is the model. Notice the disagreement between the model and the observations before 1960. Somehow you don't see this in the preceding graph. You do see it in this graph, which also happens to come from the IPCC, except they don't refer to it. It's hidden. It's in the report. You have to know where to find it. I found it. Once you find it, you can see that the models and the observations don't really agree. But never mind that. How good are the models and how good are the observations? The models, as I mentioned before, are uncertain by at least 300%, maybe 1,000%. The models are very uncertain, very uncertain. I want to concentrate here on the observations. Observations are really more concrete and I think more understandable. So these are the observations coming from weather stations on the surface of the Earth. And I think you all know the problems with weather stations. There are many, many problems. But never mind the problems with the weather stations. There are other problems too. This graph now, and that's the key graph, that is the key graph of the IPCC. This is the same set of observations as before, and these show the model results without greenhouse gases. And then the IPCC makes the extraordinary claim that this difference between the models without greenhouse gases and the observations must be due to anthropogenic effects of greenhouse gases. Mind you, they have ignored everything else. They've ignored the effects of solar activity. They've ignored the effects of cosmic rays. They've ignored the work of Svensmark in Denmark. They've ignored the work of Fahrenhold and Lüning, the Kalte Sonne. They've ignored everything. They just make the bald claim that this difference must be due to anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And that is the evidence, that is all of the evidence that they bring forth to support their summary statement in the summary of the report. There's so much wrong here that I don't know where to start, but let me start anyway. I will start with the observations. Remember, these are observations of the surface, on the surface of the Earth. I will try to show you that these surface observations, mainly from land stations, this warming here, which is the crucial warming from about 1975 to the present, is not seen anywhere else. It's not seen in the ocean data, it's not seen in the atmospheric data, and it's not seen in the proxy data. So that's what I intend to do this morning. The agreement is achieved largely by curve fitting. The evidence is shown only for the global average, not for the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, or the tropics, because it doesn't work. And they show it only for the surface and not for the atmosphere, oceans, and for proxies. And it's this gap that I showed you earlier that is their main argument for anthropogenic global warming. In fact, it's their only argument in the whole report. In all of the 1,000 pages, this one graph, 10.1b, if you want to know what it is, 10.1b, this one graph is the one that they use as the sole piece of evidence to claim anthropogenic global warming. Now, it's interesting. We believe in atmospheric theory, at least some of us do, and the atmospheric theory tells us that the surface warming must be less than the atmospheric warming by about a factor of 2. So I ask you, what is 1/2 of 0? Answers 0. This is why I have serious doubts about the claimed warming between 1975 and 2000. We don't quite know what's wrong with the weather stations, but we have serious doubt about this warming. At least I do. And we have a report published by Holger Tuss in Jena, which I think will be available, which is called NIPIC versus IPCC, published last August, and available now. We will update it again, but no change in conclusion, to show that the warming reported by IPCC, the most recent warming between 1975 and 2000, that warming is problematic, may not even exist. Interesting question is why, but that's another problem. So let me now go on to the next piece of evidence. Sea surface is not warming. Well, it is sort of, but not much. Let me show you what we have. These data come from the Hadley Center. They're not a bastion of skepticism. The Hadley Center is a fairly impartial group. Well, not quite, but they're less partial, let's say, than the IPCC. They try to be honest. It's hard sometimes to be honest, but they try. From the Hadley Center come the data on NMAT, nighttime marine air temperatures. These are temperatures measured from the deck of ships of the atmosphere just above the sea surface. These are global measurements. You notice that there's this warming between 1910 and 1940, which I said is genuine. You see it here. There's a cooling. That's genuine. And then you see a slight warming. But notice that the 1990s are no warmer than the 1940s. That's important. That's the important part. The 1990s are now not any warmer than the 1940s. It looks very different from the IPCC graph that I showed you earlier, doesn't it? This is sea surface data, just published in the Geophysics Research Letters from Viktor Gorecki in Hamburg, John Kennedy at the Hadley Center. The two of them collaborated, and again shows these are measurements of SST, that is, of sea surface temperature, of the water. And you see the warming between 1910 and 1940, the cooling, and then a slight recovery. And again, the 1990s are really not any warmer than the 1940s. Isn't that interesting? Very much different from what the IPCC uses as their evidence for anthropogenic global warming. Now let's look at proxy data. Proxy data come from tree rings, ice cores, corals, deep sea sediments, lake sediments, and so on. Stalagmites in caves, all kinds of geologic data which the geologists know how to interpret. I won't go into the details, but I would like to show you a historic one because it appears in a book I did almost 20 years ago. This is from tree rings. It shows the warming between 1910 and 1940. Do you see it here? It's genuine. It shows no warming after 1940. No warming at all after 1940. And just so you don't think that this is an isolated case, I will show you a collection of proxy data assembled by Fredrik Lundqvist in Stockholm, just published with Bo Christiansen of Copenhagen. And it's a good piece of work. They collected all of the proxy data they could find, about 30 of them. Here's what he sent me. These are 4. You'll see that most of them show the warming between 1910 and 1940, but they don't show warming after 1975. Now, proxy data have to be handled with great care. It's really a subject for specialists. They don't, I would say most proxy data do not show the warming shown by the IPCC.